Week 7 of the NFL season is in the books, and we are heading straight into week 8 of the NFL season and the 2024 fantasy football season. So you know exactly what we need to do. We need to break down every single quarterback, every single tight end for every single matchup this week, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting as we move into the week. And before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their week 8 NFL pick'ems are already going live, and Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch a free NFL pick'em to use towards week 8 action. And on top of that, all new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch are going to receive a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free pick'em for the week and up to $1,000 in bonus cash when you sign up on Underdog with promo code TheCatch. That link is down below. All right, let's kick it off with Thursday Night Football. We have the Vikings traveling to face the Steelers, and Sam Darnold, MVP on the season, had another good outing in week 7 against the Lions. 17.2 fantasy points, 22 of 27, 259 passing yards, 1 touchdown, 1 pick, 39 rushing yards. So this is a good matchup this week for Sam Darnold. He continues to be a good start. The Rams giving up the 28th most fantasy points to the quarterback position. If you own Sam Darnold, he sits at 67% rostered. If he's still out there and available, he's a great streaming option this week. There's no teams on bye week this week, but if you're not confident in your QB1 and Darnold's out there, he's a great start. If you own Darnold, he's a great start this week, and he gets the Rams this week, then the Colts and the Jaguars, the Titans, the Bears, the Cardinals, the Falcons, the Bears, the Seahawks, the Packers. This is a great schedule. Darnold should be rostered, and he is a quarterback, as long as he's healthy, that you can ride with for the rest of the season. Now, TJ Hawkinson has been limited this week so far in practice. He may get his first start of the season against the Rams here this week, and I'm okay with starting Hawkinson if you want to, but I also don't love starting a player fresh off of an injury, so he's kind of in that category. But at this point, if you own Hawkinson, you have another option that you've been used to starting. So as long as you feel good at that option, probably just roll with them. But Hawkinson is startable, and that's going to make Johnny Munt a for sure sit this week here in week 8. Not that he was necessarily a start otherwise. Now, Matthew Stafford on a short week going up against a Vikings team that is allowing the 9th fewest fantasy points to the quarterback position. Not going to be a start for me. Hasn't been a start for me really since the beginning of the season, and he has not performed like a startable quarterback in fantasy. Now, he'll get a little bit of a boost with Cooper Kupp back. We'll see how that turns out. It's a good matchup on paper for Kupp, as the Vikings have struggled against the wide receiver position, but yeah, I'm not going to start Stafford unless I'm absolutely desperate. And even then, I would be very concerned in doing so. So he's a sit for me. Colby Parkinson, I mean, one of these tight ends has some opportunity here and there, but just 5.2 fantasy points in week 7, 2 targets, 2 receptions, 32 receiving yards. He's not going to be a start for me as we move into week 8. Next up, we have the Packers traveling to face the Jaguars in another solid outing in week 7 for Jordan Love, who had 18.8 fantasy points, 24 of 33, 220 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, 2 interceptions. No rushing attempts or rushing yards, but I mean, Jordan Love, a top 10 fantasy quarterback with missing 2 games on the season, and a great spot against the Jaguars, giving up the most fantasy points to the quarterback position so far on the season. If you own Jordan Love, you are absolutely starting him this week. He's a great start. And I'm going to continue to keep the faith in Jordan Love as a strong option to head over to Underdog on and take the over on his passing yards. It's currently sitting at 248.5 passing yards, which he's only hit in 1 of the last 3 games. But against this Jaguars defense, I think that the Packers could just air it out, throw all over the place. So I would head straight to Underdog, take the over on Jordan Love's passing yards, and don't forget, new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch are going to receive a free NFL pick'em to use towards week 8's action. Take your free pick'em, take the over on Jordan Love's passing yards, and when that hits, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, Underdog is going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 when you sign up with promo code TheCatch. catch. Then we have Tucker Kraft, who had, a down week after having 2 very solid fantasy performances, but he scored a touchdown this past week, 4 targets, 3 receptions, 33 receiving yards, and that touchdown for 12.3 fantasy points. And guess what? This Jaguars team is also awful against the tight end position. So if you own Tucker Kraft, he is a strong start once again here in week 8. Moving along, we've got the Jaguars players here, and Trevor Lawrence, okay in week 7 at 15 fantasy points. Has had 14.7 or more fantasy points in his last 4 starts, but what position are you really in that you have to start Trevor Lawrence? It's not a good matchup this week against the Packers, giving up the 8th fewest fantasy points to the quarterback position. So I have no interest in Trevor Lawrence this week. You'd have to be really desperate in a double quarterback super flex format to want to start him. Brenton Strange has come back to earth. 2 targets in week 6, 0 targets last week in week 7. Not an option because Evan Ingram is back on the scene. 10 targets in week 6, 5 targets this past week, 5 receptions, 35 receiving yards, 8.5 fantasy points. If you own Evan Ingram, you're probably just rolling with the punches and take what you can get on a weekly basis. At least at the end of the day, the Jaguars are probably going to be behind in this game. They're going to need to throw the football. And Ingram right now is essentially the wide receiver 2 on this team behind Brian Thomas Jr. So Ingram is a solid start in week 8. Next up, we have the Cardinals traveling to face the Dolphins. And at the time of recording this, Monday Night Football has not been played yet. I have to record these early on Monday. Only way I can get these videos out to you guys. So, I don't know. Kyler and Trey McBride have looked against the Chargers. It's not a great matchup for them. They could struggle. They could also put up some points at home. So we'll see. But I think Kyler against the Dolphins is a solid start. Now, I will say the Dolphins, surprisingly, quietly have given up the fewest fantasy points to the quarterback position so far on the season. But as long as Kyler plays okay in week 7, I'm not going to have too much worry about him going into week 8, but if he has a down game against the Chargers, which could certainly happen, maybe you want to look at what other options you have at quarterback as the Cardinals are on the road going up against a Dolphins offense that has played well against opposing quarterbacks. But I'm expecting with Tua back in this game some points and some opportunity for Kyler Murray, so I think he is still startable this week. But maybe Monday Night Football will change our opinion of that. Trey McBride continues to be a bright spot on this Cardinals offense. Don't know how he looked in week 7. Don't really care if you own Trey McBride. You're starting Trey McBride on a weekly basis. But like I just said, Tua's going to be back here in week 8. I think Tua is startable. I don't really love starting players fresh off of injury, right? But this is a good matchup. The Cardinals have really struggled against opposing quarterbacks, giving up the 29th most fantasy points to the position. So I like Tua this week. If you have to start him, I wouldn't go out of my way to start him, but I think he could piece together a good fantasy outing this week. So not my favorite start, but he's definitely a startable player, and the matchup is good. Jonnu Smith, on the other hand, has 11.1 or more fantasy points in his last 2 starts, 22.6 fantasy points against the Colts, 7 targets, 7 receptions, 96 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Dolphins are finding ways to get him the football, but is that going to change with Tua at quarterback? Is Tyreek Hill's volume going to go up? Is Jalen Waddle's volume going to go up? Is A-Chain going to be a bigger factor? All these things could certainly happen, and the Cardinals have also struggled against wide receivers and running backs. So Jonnu Smith is a solid streaming option this week and definitely a startable player, but maybe proceed with caution because he wasn't really a factor until Tua got hurt and really hasn't been a factor outside of the last 2 weeks, except for week 2. He had a solid game against Buffalo, the game that Tua got hurt. So I'm not going to go out of my way to start Jonnu Smith, but if this pattern keeps up, he could certainly end up being a solid streaming tight end as the season progresses. Next up, we have the Jets traveling to face the Patriots, and we got a game full of streamers here. That's all it is. Just streaming options. So Rodgers, like a low-end streamer, and this is a week with no bye weeks, so I don't know that you really need to stream Aaron Rodgers, but I do like this matchup against the Patriots. I do like the potential for a good game script here. Now, the Patriots have been pretty good against opposing quarterbacks, 10th fewest points, and the Jets have been pretty good against opposing quarterbacks, also in the top 10. So I don't know exactly what we're going to get here in terms of passing games, but I could see a game script where both teams end up throwing the football a lot and we see some points. And the last time Rodgers played the Patriots this season, he had 21 fantasy points. So, he's in that streaming area, but he has struggled with turnovers the past 3 weeks with 6 total interceptions in the last 3 weeks. So he's streamable, but that's about it. Tyler Conklin, 10 fantasy points in week 7. He has double digits in 3 of his last 5 matchups. So he's always streamable, but tamper your expectations. You never exactly know what you're going to get. 4 targets, 4 receptions, 7 receiving yards, a touchdown. That saved his stat line. 10.7 fantasy points this past week. Streamable, but we'll just leave it at that. Not my favorite streamer for the week. On the other hand, Drake May, 20 or more fantasy points in his last 2 starts. He's certainly startable against the Jets. It's not the best matchup, like I said, but he's an okay start this week. We'll have to kind of see how things go. I mean, he's definitely going to be a quarterback that we can spot play as the season progresses. I don't know this is my favorite spot to play him in, but the Jets did struggle against Russell Wilson this past week. So Drake May, through his first 2 starts, has 5 touchdowns and 2 interceptions, and both those interceptions came against the Texans. So, yeah, Drake May, if you want to start him, double quarterback, super flex, whatever, I think he's startable this week. But we'll leave it at that. And I really like Drake May's current line on Underdog, sitting at 215.5 total passing yards. I mean, he has smashed that in the last 2 weeks. There's a little bit of risk here going up against the Jets and everything, but I don't know. This Jets defense really scares me, and May has looked really strong passing the football in his first 2 starts. So I would head straight to Underdog, take the over on Drake May's passing yards. Don't forget, new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH are going to get a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 8. Take your free Pick'em, pair it with Drake May's over on the passing yards, automatically triple your cash entry. And while you're doing so, Underdog is going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 when you sign up with promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. Now, in terms of Hunter Henry, I think he's a solid start this week. He has 13.1 or more fantasy points in his last 2 starts. Looks like him and Drake May have a good connection. 9 targets, 8 receptions, 92 receiving yards against the Jags last week. I like Hunter Henry this week. I think he's going to shoot up in roster percentage, sitting at 30% rostered. He's a top 10 tight end in fantasy football. I like him going into the week, and if you need a viable option at tight end moving forward, I think that Hunter Henry might actually end up being a consistent player that we can trust as the season progresses. All right, Deshaun Watson is out for the season, and what does that mean for the quarterback position for the Browns? Well, it could be DTR, but he also suffered a finger injury on his right middle finger. His X-rays have returned as negative, so I guess that's good. But we don't really know. It's going to be DTR, Jameis Winston. I put Winston on the screen because he is much more exciting from a fantasy perspective. And I think if he ends up being the starter, some of you guys out there, I don't think you're going to start him, but you might be like stashing him in a super flex format, for example. So I'm not going to start Jameis Winston. And once again, we don't know that he's a starter, but he will be the better option from a fantasy perspective. And he did throw a touchdown in week 7. And DTR threw 2 interceptions, but had some more rushing upside. I don't really want to start any Browns quarterbacks anytime soon, but we'll see how things progress with this Browns team. Now, David Njoku saw a massive amount of volume in week 7 with 14 targets, 10 receptions, 76 receiving yards, and a touchdown, 23.6 fantasy points, had 8.1 fantasy points in week 6. He's a solid start. The Ravens, a majority of the season, have struggled against opposing tight ends, so maybe the quarterback play here impacts David Njoku, and he has a bad outing. But for the most part, I think if you own David Njoku, he should be a solid start in Week 8. Moving along, we have the Eagles traveling to face the Bengals, and Jalen Hurts, a solid fantasy outing in Week 7 against the Giants. 22.7 fantasy points. Didn't do a whole lot through the air. Just 10 of 14, 114 passing yards, a passing touchdown. But he did get it done on the ground. 22 total rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, return of the tush push. He's a top 10 quarterback in fantasy football, so you own Jalen Hurts. We just continue to start Jalen Hurts on a weekly basis. Dallas Goedert missed week 7 against the Giants with that hamstring injury. If he's good to go in week 8, then I do like Dallas Goedert this week. You take what you get with Dallas Goedert and you move along. Depends on what other options you potentially have. Grant Calcaterra filled in nicely in week 6 for Dallas Goedert at the tight end position, but did not do so in week 7 with just 1.5 fantasy points, just 1 target and 1 reception. So he's not going to be an option moving into the week. We're looking at Dallas Goedert or nobody when it comes to the Eagles tight ends. And then we've got Joe Burrow, who's been playing fantastic so far on the season. I mean, I know that this Bengals offense at the end of the day feels a little bit disappointing to a degree, maybe in terms of their total amount of wins on the season. But from a fantasy perspective, we are just continuing to start Joe Burrow on a week in, week out basis, no matter what. We probably don't feel the same way about the tight end position for the Bengals, but Joe Burrow is a top 5 fantasy quarterback on the season. I know last week was a little bit of a down week with 14.9 fantasy points against the Browns, but he still threw for 2 touchdowns. He's still been very solid overall on the season. He's still a quarterback we are starting. But yeah, we're not going to start Mike Gesicki. We're not going to start Eric All. There's just nothing there from a fantasy perspective. 1.2 fantasy points in week 7 for Gesicki and 0 fantasy points in week 7 for Eric All. So no streaming options there. We're just looking at Burrow, looking at Hurts, and if he's healthy, Goddard in this matchup. Next up, we have the Colts traveling to face the Texans, and I'm just done with Anthony Richardson. I'm just done. I'm not doing it. If Joe Flacco's a quarterback, we can spot play him for the Colts, but I'm not doing Anthony Richardson until further notice. 10 of 24 in week 7 against the Dolphins, 129 passing yards, 56 yards on the ground, 0 touchdowns, a lost fumble, 8.7 fantasy points. What are we supposed to do here? Am I supposed to tell you to start Anthony Richardson? There's no way. It's not a bad matchup against the Texans. The last time he played them in week 1, he had 27 fantasy points. Maybe when everyone's zigging, we should zag here and start him. I'm not doing it, though. I'm not risking it. At this point, you have another quarterback that you're used to starting with Richardson missing time on the season. So I'm just out this week. I don't think it's worth the risk. And there's no tight end. Kylan Granson, Will Mallory, Mo Alley Cox, Drew Ogletree. There's nobody here that we can start from a fantasy perspective. So I'm staying away from everyone on the Colts as we move in to the week when it comes to quarterbacks and tight ends. Now, I got C.J. Stroud as a start. It's a pretty okay matchup here against the Colts this week. This defense has certainly struggled. It's a home game for the Texans. But what in the world did we get out of Stroud this past week? 10 of 21, 86 passing yards, 19 yards on the ground, no touchdowns, 5.3 fantasy points. And really, I mean, Stroud has like 3 solid starts on the season. Week 1 against the Colts, week 4 against the Jags, week 6 against the New England Patriots. So, I mean, it is encouraging that he had that week 1 start against the Colts. That was good. He's playing the Colts this week. But, like, you know, we're looking at 3 good starts against 3 really bad defenses, and then everything else on the season has not been good from a fantasy perspective for Stroud. So, I mean, they're number 1 in their division. They're winning football games, but the Colts are just 1 game behind the Texans right now. So this is a big game at home for the Texans, and things kind of get brushed under the rug when you're number 1 in your division. But we got to admit, I mean, C.J. Stroud next to Anthony Richardson, I mean, these might be the 2 most disappointing quarterbacks in fantasy football this season. So Stroud is a start this week, but he gets an asterisk because I'm kind of like, he's getting really close to like the Patrick Mahomes territory where it's like, I don't know if we're going to be calling this guy a starter every single week in fantasy football. But here against the Colts, we'll give it another week. Dalton Schultz, not an option. I mean, with the absence of Nico Collins, things have just not opened up for Dalton Schultz. He's remained just a super low ceiling, disappointing player on the season. The volume is just not there for Dalton Schultz. 3.8 fantasy points in week 7. We are not starting Dalton Schultz in week 8. Moving along, we got the Titans traveling to face the Lions, and I don't know in what world you would be considering starting Mason Rudolph. He is 3% rostered, maybe in a super flex or double quarterback league, but we got no bye weeks this week. There's like no real major injuries at the quarterback position. We got Tua coming back. I mean, you're not starting Mason Rudolph. Please, if you're considering starting Mason Rudolph, drop me a comment down below. I'm genuinely curious as to why you would be in that position. Chicken Conquo did have 9 fantasy points this past week, and Josh Weil at 6.4. 4 targets to both of those tight ends, but nah, I'm good. I'm not starting either of these players at the tight end position this week. You'd have to be in a super deep dynasty format where everyone's taken off the waiver wire and everyone on your team in the tight end position ends up being out this week, or there's no bye week. So yeah, you have to be in a really weird position, and I just don't think that that's going to happen for you guys. So the Lions are top 12 against the quarterback position. Please don't start Mason Rudolph this week for any reason. I think this could end up being a really strong defensive showing for the Lions at home this week. So with that being said, Jared Goff continues to be a viable option at the quarterback position on a weekly basis. 18 fantasy points in week 7. I mean, I will say the first 3 weeks of the season weren't great for Goff, but the last 3 weeks have been solid. He's a top 12 quarterback in fantasy football. So he's a solid start here against the Titans, but the Titans are top 12 against the quarterback position on the season. So this could also be a game where we see a lot of Monty and Gibbs, but I mean, this offense doing all kinds of stuff right now. If you own Goff, you want to start him. You don't have better options in front of him. He's a solid start this week. Sam Laporta, kind of down in the category for most of the season. I've said just keep rolling, taking the punches with Laporta. He is a top 15 fantasy football tight end on the year, but that's not saying much with how bad the position has been this year. Laporta's in the category. It depends on who else you have. If you got to roll him out there, sure, do it. 9.3 or more fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 matchups, but last week against the Vikings in a good game script, 2 targets, 1 reception, 25 receiving yards, 3.5 fantasy points. And even in week 6, where he had his best fantasy day of the season, it was off of 1 catch for 52 yards and a touchdown. So overall, yeah, I'm probably only starting Laporta if I have to. It's really, really not looking like he was worth his ADP in draft season. So depends on what you have, but Laporta is just kind of a only if you have to tight end here in week 8. Next up, we have the Falcons traveling to face the Buccaneers. Last time we saw these two teams play each other, we saw a lot of points and good fantasy outings for just about everyone involved. So Kirko Chains hasn't been that good the last 2 weeks. So 12.5 or less fantasy points for Kirk Cousins in the last 2 weeks. And overall, I don't really love Kirk Cousins from a fantasy perspective right now. I mean, he only has 17 or more fantasy points in 2 games on the season. Like, not really a startable quarterback in fantasy on a weekly basis. But I'll take a shot on him as a streaming option if you want to this week, because he faces the Tampa Bay Buccaneers again. Now, I don't know if we're going to be able to expect 509 passing yards and 4 passing touchdowns and 58 passing attempts, 35 fantasy points, but we'll stick with the trend here. Apparently, Kirko Chain's good against the Bucs, so you can stream him if you need to. But once again, no bye weeks. I don't really know why you would have to stream Cousins this week, but maybe double quarterback super flex, you can start him. Kyle Pitts has been good the last 3 weeks, 10 or more fantasy points in his last 3 games, 9 targets, 7 receptions, 65 receiving yards in week 7. So Kyle Pitts continues to be a solid option, and maybe this is the year that we finally get a top 10 finish out of Kyle Pitts outside of his rookie season. Let's hope to the fantasy gods that happens for those of you who drafted Kyle Pitts. Next up, we got Baker Moneymaker, and once again, Monday Night Football has not been recorded or has not been played at the time that I'm recording this, but Baker's just in that category of like, we have to start him. I mean, even if he has a bad performance against the Ravens, which I don't think he's going to, then like overall, he has on the season 19 or more fantasy points in every matchup outside of week 3, and then whatever he does in week 7. I mean, Baker is in that category of you start him no matter what. Weeks 4 through 6, he has 23 or more fantasy points in every single matchup. This offense, great. They're getting it done on the ground, through the air. Their defense is allowing for good game scripts. Continue to start Baker Mayfield. Cade Otton, I think, is just going to continue to be a streaming option at tight end. Overall, he's been solid in his last 4 games before Monday Night Football, 7.4 or more fantasy points in each of those outings. So depends maybe what he does against the Ravens, but they have struggled against the tight end position. As always, if my opinions change on the Monday Night Football players or a major injury happens, there will be a pinned comment down below. But I think for this matchup between the Falcons and the Bucks, we have 2 startable players in Baker and Kyle Pitts, and then 2 streamable players in Cousins and Cade Otton. Next up, we have the Saints traveling to face the Chargers, and boy, oh boy, what a disgusting matchup for fantasy football, especially when we're looking at quarterbacks and tight ends. So, Derek Carr, there's a chance he plays in Week 8, but if he doesn't, it's Spencer Rattler. And, yeah, we're not starting Spencer Rattler. 2 fumbles, both were lost in Week 7, 34 yards on the ground, 25 of 35, 172 passing yards, 6.2 fantasy points. Just no thank you. And side note, if Carr does play, then I'm not starting Carr. And Spencer Rattler is also questionable going into the week. So who knows when the world's going to happen with this Saints offense, but I'm not risking anything against this Chargers defense. Juwan Johnson, 4.8 points in Week 7. And then we got Foster Moreau, who had 5.8 points in Week 7. Just no thank you. Don't touch this offense outside of Alvin Kamara with a 10-foot pole right now. We're not starting any of these guys, and this could be a defensive feast for the Chargers defense in Week 8. Now, Justin Herbert, once again, Monday Night Football has not been played. Maybe he has a good outing against the Cardinals, but ultimately, I'm not going to trust Justin Herbert from a fantasy perspective. He has not been a fantasy option, not been a guy that I encourage you guys to draft in draft season, not been a guy that I've encouraged you to start at all this season. Saints defense has not looked very good the past couple of weeks, but come on, what type of position are you in that you got to start Herbert? At the time I'm recording this, he's a QB 30 in fantasy. This is a run-first offense and a play defense-first unit. We're not starting Herbert anytime soon. Will Dissly, Hayden Hurst, sometimes you see these guys get a couple catches. Sometimes you don't. Hayden Hurst is doubtful to even play in Week 7. Then you got Stone Smart and Eric Tomlinson. So, yeah, let's just say everybody's a sit. If you're in a very, very, very deep format and you're absolutely desperate for points, Will Dissly, I guess you could start, but yeah, everyone is a sit in this matchup in Week 8. Next up, we have the Bills traveling to face the Seahawks, and this should be a good game script. I mean, both these units kind of allowing for good game scripts, and Josh Allen seems to be getting back into the swing of things. He had some ups and downs to start the year, and 21 or more fantasy points in his last 2 starts, 323 passing yards in Week 7. That was his best overall day throwing the football on the season. 21 of 33, 2 passing touchdowns, just 3 rushing attempts and 1 rushing yard. But Josh Allen, just a player who you never know what you're going to get, but he's probably going to get it done. So I continue to start Josh Allen on a weekly basis. Dalton Kincaid, also a solid start. Maybe the upside's not super high, but even with the addition of Amari Cooper, he still had 6 targets, 3 receptions, 52 receiving yards this past week. And like I said, 8.2 fantasy points. So Dalton Kincaid, solid this week. And Dawson Knox, on the other hand, did nothing in Week 7, 1.5 fantasy points. He vultured that touchdown in Week 6 from Dalton Kincaid. But yeah, Knox has just not in any way been involved enough to even consider from a fantasy perspective. Moving along to the Seahawks, Geno Smith. I encourage you guys, if you needed to start Geno in Week 7, I liked him going into Week 7, still had some faith. He's a top 10 quarterback in fantasy football, 17.7 fantasy points in Week 7, 18 of 28, 207 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 15 total rushing yards. I mean, the upside's not crazy high for Geno Smith, but I'm expecting a good game script here. And I think Geno Smith is still startable, like maybe more in the streaming category. But like I said, time I'm recording this, he's the QB6. So Geno Smith, I think, is definitely startable and maybe more of a spot play. Like we look at what defenses he's playing, but I'm okay if you need to start Geno this week. Noah Fant, I mean, he does worry me. He's a little bit volatile, shows up at times, disappears at other times, but I think Noah Fant, he had 10.5 fantasy points in Week 7, 12.3 fantasy points in Week 6, 4 targets, 4 receptions, 65 receiving yards in Week 7, is certainly a startable player if you need to stream a tight end this week. Next up, we have the Bears traveling to face the Commanders, and Caleb Williams, Cole Kmet both had a bye week in week 7. They both get a good matchup this week against the Commanders on the road here. So Caleb Williams, 19 or more fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 starts. Looked really good the last 2 starts. But he played 2 of the worst defenses in the league against the Panthers and the Jaguars. But the Commanders have struggled against opposing quarterbacks, giving up the 27th most fantasy points to the position. So I like Caleb Williams this week. If you want to roll with him, go for it. Cole Kmet has been very solid on the season. He's had some ups and downs, but he's still a top 5 tight end in fantasy football. So continue to start him if you want to roll with him, like the Bears offense this week. Now, Jaden Daniels up in the air for the week, dealing with that rib injury, considered week to week. It's not a serious injury, but he could miss week 8 is a very real possibility. Now, it's not a great matchup against the Bears if he does play, but if you own Jaden Daniels and he starts, you're playing Jaden Daniels, but this purely depends on if he is healthy this week or not. And until the week goes on, we're not going to know if Jaden Daniels is going to be a startable player or not. Then we got Zach Ertz, one of my favorite streaming options over the last 2 weeks. He had 14 fantasy points in week 7, scored his first touchdown of the year. I think Zach Ertz continues to be a good start. If he's a streamer for you, that's fine too. But if you own Zach Ertz, you can probably have some confidence. Even if Marcus Mariota is the quarterback, who definitely makes for a tougher overall fantasy day for this offense. But Mariota looked good in week 7. But the Panthers defense, very different than the Bears defense. But I think Zach Ertz will still be relied on, and Mariota was still looking to Zach Ertz in week 7 against the Panthers. And then rookie Ben Sinnott had his first catch of his NFL career, which went for a touchdown. He had 8.6 fantasy points, but other than that, he's had no catches on the entire season. So shout out to Ben Sinnott. We liked Sinnott going into the year, getting his first touchdown grab and his first catch and all of that. But I don't think we're going to consider him a fantasy option here in week 8. Next up, we have the Chiefs traveling to face the Raiders. And I have Patrick Mahomes as a start going up against the Raiders, giving up the 25th most fantasy points to the quarterback position. Okay. But if it wasn't such a good matchup, I don't know if I would have Mahomes in the start category. I think he's probably closer to the streaming category. I mean, now Juju's hurt, dealing with a hamstring injury. The Chiefs got to trade for or sign another wide receiver. I just don't know what this team's going to do with the amount of injuries they've seen. But they're still undefeated. They have a phenomenal defense. There's still plenty of playmakers around here with Kelsey and Worthy and Hunt. McCole Hardman did some things this past week. Noah Gray did some things. So it's still the Chiefs and Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes, but Mahomes has 1 game this year over 16 fantasy points. He has 2 games this year over 14.9 fantasy points. It just hasn't been good. It hasn't been good. And it's not like Mahomes is playing bad necessarily. He's just not throwing touchdowns and throwing yards. So Mahomes will start this week because he gets the Raiders, but we're going to have to really start to consider what weeks we start or do not start Mahomes moving forward. And Travis Kelce, 5.7 fantasy points in week 7. Good game script, but just 5 targets, 4 receptions, 17 receiving yards after having double digits in weeks 4 and 5. But once again, it's a really strong matchup against the Raiders, so I'm okay starting Kelce this week on the road. It's a divisional game, okay? I mean, this is a game that the Chiefs are going to want to win. This is only their 2nd divisional game on the season. This is an important game for the Chiefs. Noah Gray, in a deep format, I think you could consider. He had 10.6 fantasy points this past week, but 4 targets, 4 receptions, 66 receiving yards. Just not a lot there for Noah Gray. So he might get more involved, and it is a solid matchup, but I don't want to throw him into our starting lineups just yet. Okay, moving along to the Raiders. Gardner Minshew came in of relief for Aiden O'Connell. Let's start with O'Connell, who's now expected to miss 4 to 6 weeks. He was 6 of 10 for 52 passing yards, 2 fantasy points. Gardner Minshew was 15 of 34, 154 passing yards, 3 picks, and a lost fumble. And as I started to record this video, we got word that Desmond Ridder, is being signed by the Raiders off of Arizona's practice squad. So I don't know what we're going to get at quarterback. I'm going to assume it's Gardner Minshew, and I'm going to assume that Desmond Ritter's the QB2 here this week. Maybe we see some Ritter. Maybe we don't. No matter what, don't start any of these guys, even if you're desperate in a super flex format. Start a skill position player. Stay away from these quarterbacks on the Raiders. Brock Bowers, on the other hand, the bright spot here for the Raiders offense. He is the tight end 2 on the season. He has been fantastic. 19.3 fantasy points in week 7. 14 targets, 10 receptions, 93 receiving yards. Start Brock Bowers and don't look back. He is a weekly starter no matter what. Next up, we have the Panthers traveling to face the Broncos, and this is a gross one. Let's sit Andy Dalton. Let's not go anywhere near him. 2 fantasy points, 11 of 16, 93 passing yards, 2 picks, and he had 3 yards on the ground. Struggled heavily against the Commanders. As I called in last week's Must Start Defenses videos, he's going to struggle again this week against the Broncos, which I called in this week's Must Start Defense video. So, just staying away from Andy Dalton, staying away from any tight end, Ja'Tavion Sanders, who did have an okay week 7 and was pretty good in week 6. Let's hand that to him. 12.1 fantasy points in week 7, 6 targets, 6 receptions, 61 receiving yards. And Tommy Tremble was out last week, but yeah, there's just not enough here. Ian Thomas got some involvement, but yeah, I'm just staying away because I think this Broncos defense is going to have a big week. Now, the Panthers defense continues to struggle, and Bo Nix has been pretty okay the last couple weeks. A little bit more of a running game in week 7, a defensive game in week 7, but he had 14 fantasy points, 16 to 26, 164 passing yards, 75 yards on the ground for Bo Nix, and this is a great matchup at home. So you need to stream Bo Nix. I mean, go for it. He's a top 15 fantasy football quarterback right now. Don't go out of your way to do so, but it's a good matchup. The most involved tight end on the Broncos team in the last 3 weeks has been Lucas Krull, who had 4 targets, 3 receptions, 41 receiving yards, and 7 fantasy points in week 7. I'm still going to sit him. I feel bad I put Lucas Krull on the screen and not Ja'Tavion Sanders, who had more fantasy points than Krull, but I mean, for the most part, we're going to sit all Panthers tight ends, and we're going to sit all Broncos tight ends. And the only player I think you can really consider in this matchup in terms of quarterbacks tight ends is going to be Bo Nix. Moving along to Sunday Night Football, we have the Cowboys traveling to face the Niners. So let's start with Dak Prescott, and I still got him in the, kind of fringe area. You can start Dak Prescott this week. I'm not ultimately too scared of the Niners defense here. Should be a good game script, and the Cowboys do this. Dak does this. They have those, 1 or 2 games in the season where they get blown out and Dak looks awful, but Dak is still a decent fantasy option. Had 2 passing touchdowns in 3 of his last 4 games before the week 6 blowout at home against the Lions. So, I still think Dak Prescott is a startable quarterback. Really good upcoming schedule. The Niners this week, the Falcons, the Eagles, the Texans, the Commanders, the Giants, the Bengals, the Panthers, the Bucks, and the Eagles. Lots of NFC East matchups there. Lots of good game scripts. Dak Prescott, I think, will still finish as like a top 12 fantasy quarterback. Maybe the upside's capped here, but he's still a solid option as the season goes on. And I'm not going to overreact ultimately too much to week 6. And same goes for Jake Ferguson, who had a down week in week 6. I'm not going to completely overreact here. I still think he's a completely fine starter this week. The team as a whole struggled in week 6, but Ferguson, since returning from injury, has been very solid for the most part with double digits in 3 of his last 4 starts. So expecting a good game script here. Should be a good matchup against the Niners. Ferguson's a good start, and Prescott is still startable as we approach the week. Looking to Brock Purdy and the San Francisco 49ers starters here. You start Brock Purdy if you own him. He's a top 10 quarterback in fantasy football. You roll with the punches. You take what you can get, right? 3 passing touchdowns in week 6. No interceptions against the Hawks. Week 7, 0 passing touchdowns, 3 interceptions, but had 2 rushing touchdowns. Weird game for Purdy and Mahomes. Neither threw any passing touchdowns. Both threw a couple interceptions. Both had at least 1 rushing touchdown. Good situation here because the Niners need to get some victories piled up here and need a win before the week 9 bye. So You own Purdy. Just keep starting him. It's a good game script here and a good matchup on Sunday Night Football. And the Cowboys have struggled against opposing quarterbacks all season long. George Kittle, your tight end 1 in fantasy football, 15.2 fantasy points in week 7 against the Chiefs. 7 targets, 6 receptions, 92 receiving yards. He looks great. And Purdy has been looking in Kittle's direction in every single game. I mean, he's almost acting as the wide receiver 1. And now we're getting news that Debo, has been hospitalized dealing with pneumonia. Ayuk's out for the season. But it is worth noting that Kittle is dealing with a foot sprain in his day-to-day. So as long as Kittle is healthy, you are starting him, and he could see increased volume this week as well. We'll find out. But you own Kittle, you start him. You own Purdy, you start him. Ferguson's a good start this week, and Prescott is still startable as we move into week 8. Next up, we have the Giants traveling to face the Steelers, and I'm just sitting Daniel Jones. I mean, he had a couple games here, looked like a streaming option here and there. I'm not risking it against the Steelers defense. They could be in Daniel Jones's face the entire game, giving up the 4th fewest fantasy points to the quarterback position. Not streaming him. Not starting him in a double quarterback or super flex league. Staying far away from Daniel Jones this week. I think this could be a really tough week for Danny Dimes and company. Theo Johnson, 0 fantasy points in week 7. Daniel Bellinger, 2.1 fantasy points in week 7. No thank you. Staying away from both the tight ends in terms of the Giants players. Then we got my guy, Russell Wilson. And I mean, I told you guys going into week 7, especially in double quarterback super flex leagues, pick up Russell Wilson. I don't know if this, everyone's just making fun of Russell Wilson going into week 7, saying why are they benching Fields? This is going to be a disaster, all this stuff. And I mean, Fields was fine. Don't get me wrong. And Fields was a viable fantasy starter, but they essentially had no passing game through the first 6 weeks of the season. Some bright spots against the Colts, and Fields was okay against the Chargers, but other than that, 156 or less passing yards in every single game. Fields was fine. Don't get me wrong. I'm not here to, be down on Fields, who still stands as a top 10 quarterback in fantasy football, but the passing game completely opened up against the Jets, who were a little banged up in terms of their defensive starters in the secondary, but on the most part have been a very good secondary on the season. So Russell Wilson, it started off not so great, opened up that passing game, threw some good balls, threw some touchdowns, 264 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. The offense looked completely different. He was 16 of 29. He wasn't great, don't get me wrong, but he also had a rushing touchdown, 24 fantasy points. He's certainly a streaming option this week. The Giants giving up the 20th most fantasy points to the quarterback position, double quarterback, super flex. You can roll with Russell Wilson, and the Steelers have a bye week, and I talked about this in the waiver wire video, even if Russ had a bad game in week 7 and maybe struggles against the Giants in week 8, who their defense has been good at times on the season, after the bye week in week 9, the Commanders, the Ravens, the Browns, the Bengals, the Browns again, the Eagles, the Ravens, bad matchup in week 17 against the Chiefs, but for the most part, this is a really solid stretch over the next couple weeks after the week 9 bye week for the Steelers offense. So Russell Wilson, I do think is going to be an option that we can stream and or spot play as the season progresses. I don't know if he's always going to have 24 fantasy points, but he is certainly going to be a player we can consider as the season progresses. And if he's not, then we'll consider Justin Fields again, right? But Pat Freiermuth, it hasn't been pretty, and I don't prefer to start him, but he's a top 10 fantasy tight end this year. And that's not saying much with the tight end play we've gotten, but 3 targets, 2 receptions, 51 receiving yards, 7.1 fantasy points in week 7. The ceiling's not super high. He did have a touchdown call back in week 6, or else he'd be looking pretty good over the past 4 weeks, but he's always startable. The ceiling's not high, but you can take what you can get when you start Pat Freiermuth, and we'll just leave it at that as we move into week 8. And that'll do it for today's video. There's every single quarterback, every single tight end, every single matchup, who you should be starting or sitting here in week 8 of the season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into the week, drop me a comment. I'll answer every single comment before Thursday Night Football and before Sunday's slate of games. And don't forget, as the week progresses, we'll have everything that you guys could possibly need here on the channel for week 8 of the season. Start sits at every single position, must start defenses, kicker rankings, players that you cannot bench that are going to go nuclear this week, buy low options, sneaky starts, last minute waiver options, fantasy Q&A streams, everything that you guys will need here on the channel. So make sure that you guys are subscribed so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.